Let's take you live to Parliament House now. This is Tony Burke moving a censure motion against the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison for his secret ministries.
Home Affairs on 6 May 2021 and 2, did not inform A, the Cabinet, B, the relevant departments, C, the House of Representatives, or D, the Australian public about the additional appointments, and C, as found by the Honourable Virginia Bell AC, the actions and failures of the member for Cook, 1, fundamentally undermined the principles of responsible government because the member for Cook was not responsible to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the electors for the department he was appointed to administer, and 2, were apt to undermine public confidence in government and were corrosive of trust in government, and 2, therefore censures the member for Cook for failing to disclose his appointments to the House of Representatives, the Australian people and the Cabinet, which undermined responsible government and eroded public trust in Australia's democracy. Mr Speaker, today is not how any of us wanted to make history. Today is something which, for any other circumstance, for any other former Prime Minister and certainly even for the member for Cook, had the disclosure not been made available about the multiple ministries, we would not be here now. But a censure, while rare, has its place. The last time this Parliament had a censure of a Member of Parliament, it was a former minister, and it was done so unanimously. It was done so unanimously on a former minister on the following basis. The decision was made, and I read this, that he fell below the standards expected of a member of the House. It wasn't that he had acted unlawfully. It was that he had fallen below the standards expected of a member of the House. That is the test. The test for a censure, while rare, is not a test of, well, would the courts overrule it? The courts are the place to determine whether or not something was lawful. But in the Parliament, we determine whether or not something was appropriate. And I ask all members to think back to the first moment they heard about the multiple ministries, what their reaction was. Some gave their reaction on the record, many more gave their reaction off the record. But nobody gave a reaction, with the exception of the member for Cook himself. Nobody else gave a reaction that said that this was acceptable or that it met the standards expected of this House. There are many countries, many democracies, that have a system different to ours. There are many democracies around the world where the system of government is that the executive are quite separate to the legislature. Our system is responsible government. The executive are here in this room for the purpose of being held to account every day the legislature sits. That entire concept of responsible government only works if the Parliament, and through the Parliament the Australian people, know which members of the executive are responsible for what. This is not some small matter. It goes to the absolute core of the principle of responsible government. And it was responsible government was what Ms Bell referred to specifically, where in her report she said, and I quote, "The principles of responsible government were fundamentally undermined." I quote again, "The lack of disclosure of the appointments to the public was apt to undermine public confidence in government." I quote again, "The secrecy with which the appointments had been surrounded was corrosive of trust in government. If we could unanimously determine that the conduct of Bruce Bilson fell short of the standards, how on earth can the multiple ministries, can question time after question time where we in fact did not know where portfolios had been allocated, how on earth can that not meet the standard? Question time is viewed as the most significant part of the parliamentary day when every member turns up. It's not a requirement that every member turns up, it is a convention. But we have to defend our conventions too. And the core of responsible government was breached with the multiple appointments. In doing so, the member for Cook did not tell ministers themselves that he had sworn into their portfolios. His cabinet was not told. The department secretaries were not told. The parliament was not told. And through the parliament, the Australian people were not told. The member for Cook, in doing this, did not just fall below the standards expected. He undermined them, he rejected them, he attacked them, and he abused them. How do we even know that all this happened? We know because at the same time that the member for Cook was not telling his colleagues, was not telling the parliament, and was not telling the Australian people, he was telling some journalists writing a book. He thought it was interesting to contribute to the publication of a book, but not important to let anybody know where it was directly relevant to them. And the defences that have then been offered, including the defences offered by the member for Cook through his lawyers to the Bell inquiry, are logically impossible. Logically impossible. The member for Cook, through his lawyers, said that, and I'll quote here, however, this in no way suggests that he did not expect that the usual practice would apply and that PM&C would publish the appointments in the Gazette. It beggars belief that the member for Cook is now arguing that it was somehow just presumed it would have been made public in the Gazette, and yet he was making sure he didn't tell the ministers themselves. And when asked about the ministers, he said the reason he didn't want to tell them, and this was on the 17th of August, was, "I did not wish ministers to be second-guessing themselves." Both cannot be true. It cannot be the case that it was presumed it was going to come out in the Gazette and it was important for people to not be told. To this day, the different versions being offered by the member for Cook cannot reconcile themselves with each other. In the same way that when this started to emerge, when only health, finance and industry, science, resources appointments had been known, on radio the member for Cook said, was asked, just can we be clear, are there other portfolios that you assumed any control over? The answer, not to my recollection. I don't recall any others being actioned. It beggars belief that anyone in Australia's history could forget that they had been appointed Treasurer. It just beggars belief. At the start of question time each day, when a minister is not present, every Prime Minister has an obligation to allow the House to know who answers questions on their behalf. And yet at those exact moments, the former Prime Minister never once said that he, in fact, was sworn into different portfolios and could answer those questions as well. The pathway of question time, the pathway of what this House did last term was different because we were deceived. It was different. Questions were asked in different forms to different people because we weren't told. Now, it is true that what happened here was the end of a long process of enabling. When conventions were attacked one after the other, it led in a direct line to where we ended up. When we had the situation of it being constant silencing of opposition voices, when we had a cabinet committee with only one member, when we had a circumstance where for the first time in living memory, a speaker, a member of their own party, made a recommendation for a privileges reference which could have led to censure of one of their own, that they used their numbers to prevent the independence of the Speaker being recognised, to defend, and I hear the comment there, it's just politics. If that's the attitude, then you would never have censured Bruce Bilson. Every single threshold that has previously resulted in a censure being given of a member is met today, and is met more strongly today than it ever has been before. This place runs on rules and conventions. The mere existence of the office of Prime Minister and the existence of a cabinet is a convention. It's not in the Constitution, it's not required. It is a convention on which our system of government hangs. The concept that the parliament knows who has which job is essential to responsible government. You cannot have responsible government if you don't know what people are responsible for. And for 2 years, we didn't know. For 2 years, the ministers themselves did not know. For 2 years, departmental secretaries were unaware of who the ministers were to whom they had responsibility. The gravity of what we are dealing with today is a censure motion beyond what the parliament has previously dealt with. Because previously what we've dealt with is the conduct of one member being sufficiently bad that we needed to defend the House as a whole to say that is not allowed to happen. On this occasion, the conduct of one member prevented the House from doing its job. The conduct of one member prevented the House from knowing who was responsible for what. The fact that that one member was also the Prime Minister of Australia means that what we are dealing with now isn't just unprecedented, could not have been predicted, but is so completely unacceptable. For members today, I say to those opposite, there'll be some thinking, well, yes, they opposed it, but their party's made a decision, they've got to lock in, they've got to follow what their leader wants, and that's just where they're at.
Order. The member for Groom.
I just remind those members opposite of this.
Members on my left.
I remind those members opposite of this. That is exactly what happened for the whole of the last term. It is exactly how every precedent was trashed. It is exactly how the principles of responsible government ended up being attacked in ways that hadn't happened before. There is no previous Liberal Prime Minister where this sort of motion would ever be moved. But the conduct that happened in the last term that we now know about was unacceptable, fell below the required standards, and we have no choice but to support a censure.
Order.